this has just been par for the course for me lately.
Yeah, but this is, I mean, you know what it's normally like here. This is crazy. Well, yes, you're going to hear some mowing. Okay, it's the weekend.
Mowing and
but
either a phone
else.
call or a YouTube video. I'm not sure what that was.
Yeah.
The party that's happening with a bunch of people yelling at each other. And the thing that was supposed to make that not an issue, the lav mics aren't working.
Yeah.
So it's strange for sure. Yeah. But let's continue.
Okay.
I think that we have at least some usable stuff. It doesn't have to be the best looking thing in the world for it to be useful.
Do you want to start with a comment I made to you on the phone, I think? Your dad and I saw this and lived through this period back in the 60s and never thought we would see it again, but here it is. We were in New Jersey, where we were born and bred. So even though we would have experienced, I'm sure at some points, racism, but it wasn't overt. We went to public schools that were fully integrated schools. So we never knew the segregation the way it was known in the South. However, we were definitely exposed through the media, just like we're exposed to, what happened to George Floyd and what's happening in other places, and also here, I'm sure, regarding police brutality. But at that time, we felt that we were removed from it. We were teenagers. We saw it on the news, horrific images, dogs being set on protesters, and listening to some things that were awful in terms of people not just being treated, but just being viewed as animals. We were very thankful that we were born where we were born and being raised to where we were being raised. At the same time, though, we knew we were all the same people, and it could have been us. And we had empathy for all those who were protesting. And the two strongest memories I have are the one that I just mentioned about the video, which you've probably seen on TV, with the dogs being let loose on the protesters and the hoses being opened on them. Mm-hmm. Actually, there are three. And one was of lynching, where we saw bodies hanging from trees. And I guess after that, the positive image we had was of the March on Washington, which I was rather young to go, but your Aunt Sandra went, and the church sent a busload of people down at the time. So we sat glued to the TV, watching that for hours and listening to Martin Luther King deliver his speech, which was a wonderful thing. And of course, years later, when he was assassinated, we remember the rioting and the looting and the anger.
Did that happen where you guys were too?
Some of it, yeah.
There was a place called the Dayton Street Projects, and I remember people on the standing on the roof of these project buildings, throwing firebombs down on the police. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was a young black man walking down the street, and he got arrested for no reason at all. For no reason at all. They grabbed him and handcuffed him, threw him in the police car. And that started the whole thing. But the heavy thing about that whole thing is this. I saw our people, it was like they just exploded. They just exploded. I mean, they burnt buildings down. They attacked people. And there was this one thing that really shook me up. My father was a pastor in Newark, New Jersey. We were on our way to church this one particular Sunday morning during the riots. There was a tank, an army tank, in the middle of the street and stopping everybody, looking at their identification and checking people, searching people's cars. It was unreal. And these were all National Guard people. And it was to me, it was a very, very frightening. Mm-hmm. Very frightening. I was scared. I'll be honest with you. I was afraid. And we saw all kinds of things. And looking at things that happened in Alabama, looking at things that have, looking at the police sicking dogs on people, beating people with nightsticks, turning water hoses on people, dragging people off to jail and stuff, and stomping on people and stuff, and it was just unreal. Looking at that, I never thought that I would live through another set of riots and now we're looking at the same exact thing.
A byproduct of all of that in Jersey City that I recall, we did have some, I remember looting nearby us on Jackson Avenue, which later became Martin Luther King Drive. And for our section of town in Greenville, it was the major shopping area. So there were a lot of some small chains, but basically individually owned, privately owned shops for about 6, maybe 8 blocks. And I remember them as a little girl, with the lights at the holiday time, and you got to know the owners of the establishments, all of that, and you could shop freely. It was, the 50s when I was a little girl, and then the 60s. But all that ended with the riots because there was looting and a lot of property damage done on that street. And then slowly but surely, well, I shouldn't say slowly, some of it happened pretty quickly. But for those diehards, slowly but surely, they closed up shop and moved away. So we went from a thriving commercial district to practically no businesses other than grocery store and like a vegetable market kind of place. So it was very sad to see that happen. And of course, it became very inconvenient for folks there, where you would be able to walk to do most of your shopping. You had to travel. Didn't have a car, so you had to take a bus to get things that you used to be able to get practically around the corner. So that's a byproduct.
Yeah, but, people have been talking about inconveniences lately, about the riots and about people protesting, blocking traffic or the interstate or whatever. But things oftentimes don't happen without those inconveniences.
There's always a price to be paid. And when you consider that against people dying, it's a small price to pay. But it just stuck in my memory, probably because as a child, I enjoyed it so much. Not that I had a whole lot of money to shop. I just enjoyed looking in the windows and dreaming.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good point, because children oftentimes don't have the correct experience to put all of these things into context.
Right.
So I'm assuming that Grandma was entirely too busy with the 5 of you, or the 4 of you if Aunt Sandra was already kind of old enough to go to Washington.
Yes. Yeah, she went to Washington with a number of other people from the church. And she would have been...
Well, if I did my math correctly, you guys were 17 and 18 respectively when Dr. King got shot.
Yes, I was 17.
So I was 17 when 9/11 happened. And I remember that day like it was yesterday.
Yes.
Not to dwell on Dr. King, it's just to put you guys' lives in context. What was high school like for you? What was like grade school like for you guys?
In what sense?
Up north, were schools already, were they integrated?
Yes.
All the way through. That's
Yes.
all we knew. That's all we knew. And in Jersey City, there was a large. We didn't have at that time many of the Latino population there. It was basically Black, Caucasian, and among the Caucasians there was a pretty large segment of Jews.
Okay.
So we had Jews, Catholics, and Black Protestants for the most part.
We never really talked about race too much growing up.
No,
it was
we did
something
not.
It was something that I was sort of always reminded about in these tiny little ways that I didn't really understand was about race until I got older.
We had initially at least I had a great deal of trepidation about the South because the South was framed by those images that I mentioned to you, by the dogs and the hoes and the lynchings, and I realized that they were past that, at least for the most part. We weren't going to the Deep South, we weren't going way out in the country somewhere, but I was sure that there was a lot of resentment and prejudice against, underneath the surface, such that I didn't even look into a possibility of coming here for grad school. When I had to choose schools for graduate school in business, an option was to go to Chapel Hill, I believe.
Let's back up because that's an interesting thing. Did you ever find like much pushback on trying to get a graduate degree?
No, no. That's a story. They looked for me. I wasn't looking to go to graduate school. That's a separate story, I think. By the time I graduated from college, to tell you the truth, when I entered college,
Where did you go to college?
I went to Duquesne University in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
I applied to several colleges. I was thankfully accepted into all of them, and I went where they gave me the most money to go to school because obviously my mom was not able to send me to school, so I had to get scholarships and loans to go to school. That was a given. I understood that. That was never an issue. But by that time, I graduated from high school in '69. King had died in '68, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of affirmative action activity as a result of that, which I benefited from.
Sure.
When I went to school, there was the largest incoming group of black students they had ever had, I believe, up to that point.
I wonder what it was before that, though.
But I also went. Duquesne is a Catholic school.
Mm. But you went to Catholic high school and
No,
stuff.
I did not. Your Aunt Dawn did, but I went
okay.
to a public school all the way through. Public school. They also set up, I think it was called the Black Counseling and Learning Center, where they hired 2 counselors, one male and one female, to work with us, to help us with any issues. I don't want to say to mainstream us, but they figured there would be some issues we would have which they would not be equipped to handle. So they hired them to do that. I also became acquainted with and active in the Black Student Union at that time, as most of us did. So we got to know each other. We kind of hung out together. We're very comfortable around each other, as well as getting to know other students. I had no choice but to get to know others because most of the time, since I was in a business school, I was the only black student in the room.
Did you ever step back and think about what that meant? Or were you just trying to like make it through with because sometimes when you're trying to get something done, you're not necessarily thinking about cultural implications. You're just a person trying to live your life and do what you can.
I would say primarily trying to live my life, although I was conscious of it. It was not an issue for most of the students, and if it was an issue, they kind of kept it to themselves and just may have kept a distance. But I made some very good friends then that are still friends today. But in general, I was still aware of it, and I would joke about it every now and then. So I made them aware of it, my friends anyway, or my peers anyway. There was one young man who was out of our group, a young black man who was in a couple of my classes the first semester, I think. Then he decided business wasn't for him. He switched to pre-law, I think. Remember the fact that your dad and I, we'd always gone to integrated schools, even though I was aware of the fact that the numbers were off from what I was used to. Being in a school that was predominantly white, though, was not foreign to me. That was not a particular concern. I was there to get a degree, and that was my focus.
Okay.
Especially since I had a difficult time, making that transition my first year to that level of work. But not because of where I was, because I wasn't in many ways prepared. I never learned how to study until I got to college. So I was really concerned about making it.
That's fair.
Mm-hmm.
You were playing out at that time, Dad.
Yes.
Were you primarily in church, or were you a part of the club scene at that time?
I was a part of the club scene as well.
There are fairly famous stories about how black musicians had a hard time, specifically in jazz bars, because, there was a time where jazz was considered the blacks' plot to lure in and corrupt the white women.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think
But
I've ever heard
I,
it quite like that before.
well, I mean, but that's sort of just true. You ended up being interested in funk and stuff, and so we're in a different era of music at that point. Can you tell me about that?
down in South Jersey, there was it was very, very prejudiced.
Like, openly prejudiced.
Openly.
Can you give me an example of what you might encounter?
You were with Pat and Sharman.
I was playing in a band, and I was the only black guy in the band. I was a drummer at the time, and we went to a club to play, and the management told the leader of the band that if they got another drummer, a white drummer, they could play the gig. So we packed up and left. And see, and back then, everybody that played, you had to be a member of the musicians union. The union rep would come to wherever you played at, and this was another form of segregation as well.
I'm assuming because at least certain pockets of the musicians union were trying to keep as many black people out as possible.
Exactly. And they reported this incident to the musicians union, and they never did anything about it. They just, oh well, it was that kind of thing. So, I've seen my share of segregation and being not being able to play places because of being a black man. You see, so that was, but
I'm sorry, was that the only time that happened, or
it happened a couple of more times, but it was all South Jersey, down near Atlantic City, places around there. And and by the way, I was playing in a black band, and we had a gig in South Jersey, and when we got down there, they wouldn't let us play.
wasn't it indicated that you guys were all black before you came out?
The people didn't know who we were.
That's
they
fair.
Just they hired a band. At the particular time, we had a white agent, a white booking agent that booked the clubs.
And this white agent was oblivious to the fact that certain
Yes. The only thing that she was concerned with was getting her commission. So she went and got jobs. I really, and I never really, to be honest with you, I never really got the whole story of how that whole thing played out. But the one thing I do know is when we got there, the people told us that they had hired another band and we wasn't needed. And we walked in and looked, and the bandstand, the stage was full of equipment, and there were white musicians setting up.
So somehow they got word that you were black even before you got there and made other arrangements, but didn't tell the agent?
That's what that's my question, Ma.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's why that story in particular was a little confusing. And I know that you don't have the answers. It's just, I don't know, it sort of gets the wheels turning.
We were stopped before we even got a piece of equipment off of the truck.
The manager came to
the manager of the club or owner, whoever he was, came to the club, came to the door, came outside and told us, don't unload because we got another band and you all are not needed.
I've played a place down here that actually wouldn't let me in the door because they didn't believe I was with the band that I said I was with. I was playing a country bar.
You told me about a country bar. that was a problem. I was thinking it was in South Carolina.
It was here.
It was here.
So the South Carolina thing was a black-owned establishment, actually, which is a whole other conversation. If the South was a problem, or you had some apprehension in coming down here, why come down here with me and my sibling?
Well, your uncle Ronald moved here first, and almost as soon as he got here, he started calling us and telling us we needed to come visit. It's not like you thought. It's a great place to raise Jonathan. Samantha wasn't born yet. And you need to come, you need to come. So that following summer, when I was off from school, because I was teaching at the time, we came down and visited for probably about 4 or 5 days. It wasn't quite a week, but it was a good length of time. And we fell in love with it. You have to remember, too, what was happening back home in that the drug issue, it's everywhere, but it was particularly dominant in the area in which we lived. We were trying to get away from that. We lived at that point, we lived in a row house, which was built, I believe, in the early 20s, and this was the 80s. Our lot size was 18 feet wall to wall. We had a small backyard, and the little front yard, which was fenced in, was basically concrete with one bush. We could not let you out by yourself. At least we didn't feel comfortable, even with the fence, with you riding around, on your little tricycle. And we just watched the neighborhood change. The neighborhood that we moved from had changed dramatically, even though we were diagonally across from a police station. And then we watched this smaller neighborhood change as well. And it was extremely expensive. The price that we sold our small house for up there, a house that needed renovation, some renovation had been done before we moved in, but it still needed more work, which at the time we couldn't afford to do. Basically the same thing that we sold that house for, we bought the house that we moved into North Carolina for, that was a story and a half, Cape Cod, with 3/4 of an acre of land.
So,
and we felt comfortable because of the nature of the neighborhood, that you can go outside and play, we don't have to worry, et cetera, et cetera. And our interactions while we were here on vacation before we decided to move were positive. We went into stores, we looked at houses, we went to open houses. Everyone treated us with a degree of respect. If they thought something different, if they felt something different, they didn't let it show.
okay. But that wasn't always the case.
Here?
Yeah.
Oh, no, it was not. But this was the late 80s.
Okay. So, but I want to hear about those experiences where it wasn't.
Well, not here. Going back to what your father was saying about South Jersey, even though, well, no, it was true where we lived too.
Yeah.
Because we knew that no matter how much money we had, and we didn't have a whole lot, that there were places in New Jersey where we couldn't live because of the color of our skin.
Yeah.
We had even tried to get an apartment after we got married in Bayonne, but it was not in the section where blacks already lived. It was in another section. We couldn't get an apartment. I had a good job at the time. The gentrification and the wooing of the New Yorkers to New Jersey came later, came after we moved here, basically. It might have been starting a little bit around the time that we moved, but that process, well, it started downtown before we left.
Yeah.
Yeah, started downtown before we left.
too dark.
Okay.
So
All right.
I'm gonna have to come back here and do this again.